Good morning and welcome to our noontime call. We have a few others joining us. I'd like to just start out by thanking Oakview National Bank for
Your phone's
being
not
our...
in them, are they? Your phone's not in your shoe, is it?
Hang on just a minute. Let me just... Let's see. Right, there we go. Okay, I would like to thank Oakview National Bank for being our sponsor for this program. And they are located in Culpeper, Marshall, and Warrenton. And thank you to Oakview Bank, National Bank for helping make this program possible. We are very happy to welcome George Worthington. Thank you, George, so much for being with us. George is the Dementia Services Coordinator for the Virginia Department of Aging and Rehabilitative Services. Thank you for your time, George, and I will just one quick question, one quick comment. If you have not already muted your speaker, if you could go ahead and do that, it's a little easier for everyone involved to hear. And George, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you. We are recording this program and will be available later on the Aging Together website. Thank you so much, George.
Thanks, Anna. It's my pleasure to be here. And hi, everybody. Nice to see so many people interested in learning about brain health and what you can do to help lower your risks of potentially developing dementia. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully everybody can see the slide. Great.
Looks good.
All right. So I'm going to start with a little bit of kind of a brief introduction about the research that has helped inform us learn about brain health and dementia risk reduction. There's been a huge increase in knowledge in the last even 3 or 4 years, I would say. So much so that in our state dementia plan, which was just published in January, we actually included a new goal for the very first time around brain health and dementia risk reduction. So this is, and mainly in recognition that this is now something that we know a lot about, and that we want to share that information and make sure that folks are aware of things that they can do to help protect their brain and to potentially reduce their risks of developing dementia. So I'm going to start with a quick video that's going to just give you some basic information about, if I can get there, basic information about Alzheimer's disease and dementia more generally. And just a second. Always want to be able to do this seamlessly, never quite get there. Okay. Sound. Everybody see the video? Great.
In healthy people, all sensations, movements, thoughts, memories, and feelings are the result of signals that pass through billions of nerve cells or neurons in the brain. Neurons constantly communicate with each other through electrical charges that travel down axons, causing the release of chemicals across tiny gaps to neighboring neurons. Other cells in the brain, such as astrocytes and microglia, clear away debris and help keep neurons healthy. In a person with Alzheimer's disease, the most basic form of dementia, toxic changes in the brain destroy this healthy balance. These changes may occur years, even decades, before the first signs of dementia. Researchers believe that this process involves 2 proteins, called beta amyloid and tau, which somehow become toxic to the brain. It appears that abnormal tau accumulates, eventually forming tangles inside neurons. And beta amyloid clumps into plaques, which slowly build up between neurons. As the level of amyloid reaches a tipping point, there is a rapid spread of tau throughout the brain. But tau and beta amyloid may not be the only factors involved in Alzheimer's. Other changes that affect the brain may also play a role over time. The vascular system may fail to deliver sufficient blood and nutrients to the brain. The brain may lack the glucose needed to power its activity. Chronic inflammation sets in as microglial cells fail to clear away debris, and astrocytes react to distressed microglia. Eventually, neurons lose their ability to communicate. As neurons die, the brain shrinks, beginning in the hippocampus, a part of the brain important to learning and memory. People may begin to experience memory loss, impaired decision-making, and language problems. As more neurons die throughout the brain, a person with Alzheimer's gradually loses the ability to think, remember, make decisions, and function independently. Achieving a deeper understanding of the molecular and cellular mechanisms and how they may interact is vital to the development of effective therapies. Much progress has been made in identifying various underlying factors. Advances in brain imaging allow us to see the course of plaques and tangles in the living brain. Blood and fluid biomarkers are providing insights about when the disease starts and how it progresses. More is also known about the genetic underpinnings of the disease and how they can affect particular biological pathways. These advances enable the development and testing of promising new therapies, including drugs that reduce or clear the increase of tau and amyloid proteins in the brain, therapies targeting the vascular system, glucose metabolism, and inflammation, and lifestyle interventions like exercise or diet, and behavioral approaches like social engagement that may enhance brain health. Research is moving quickly, ever closer to the day when we can delay or even prevent the devastation of dementia.
Okay, so hopefully that was informative. What always strikes me about that video is really how little is certain. So there was a lot of words like we think, scientists believe, it's thought. So really, even what causes Alzheimer's disease isn't really certain, even after decades of research. So we think that tau and amyloid play a role, but we're not quite sure what that is. There are other things that affect the brain, many things that affect the brain. And of course, the brain affects everything that we do. So why is brain health important? So I don't know if anybody here had heard of brain health even 5 years ago. I know I had not really heard of the term much before that. But in the last few years, brain health has become a really important topic, and a lot of not only research, but also federal dollars more generally have gone into helping support brain health initiatives. And one of the reasons is that research really started to come together showing that that there were modifiable risk factors for dementia. So I know you can't see this diagram very well, but I just wanted to flash it up here, and I'll put a table on the next slide that has all of this information. But this is a life course approach to dementia risks. And while about 60% of dementia risks are non-modifiable, things like age and genetics, there are about 40% of risk factors that are potentially modifiable. Now, I will say that this is a population level number. So it doesn't mean that if you adopted all of these, if you made changes to affect all of these risk factors, it doesn't mean that you would reduce your own risk of developing dementia by 40%. It could be more, it could be less. We're all different, and it would depend on your own physical makeup. But the 12 risk factors that were identified by the Lancet Commission back in 2020 covered the whole life course. So in early life, education was the biggest risk factor. So the more education you have, the better early in your life. And we think that the more education you have, it builds what's called cognitive reserve. So if you do start experiencing the changes that are the result of Alzheimer's disease or other dementias, that cognitive reserve can help slow that progress of the disease. Encouragingly, another 15% of the population level risk factors were things that you could address in midlife. Midlife being 40s, 50s, 60s. So hearing loss is the most important one. I'm going to talk about most of these risk factors as I go forward, but I just wanted to highlight them all together. And hearing loss particularly, I'll spend some time on. But also traumatic brain injury. So protecting your head from falls and accidents can help reduce your risks of developing dementia. Addressing high blood pressure is important. Reducing your alcohol consumption. So 21 units a week or less. I think that's about 1 drink a day. And then obesity. So reducing your weight in midlife can also help reduce your risk of developing dementia. But I find the really encouraging thing is that even in later life, nearly half of that dementia risk can still be addressed and make a difference. So stopping smoking, addressing or treating depression, addressing social isolation, getting some exercise, reducing your exposure to air pollution. So that might be like the wildfires, the smoke that was coming into our region from Quebec and other places in Canada last year. Staying inside when the haze was bad can help reduce your risks of developing dementia. And then also addressing diabetes was another risk factor. Now I'm going to talk about a couple of risk factors that aren't on this table as well, and I'll explain why they weren't on this table as I get there. And I should have time for plenty of time for questions in the end. So if you have questions, just jot them down and I'll get to them after I finish the slides. So I'm going to talk about 3 studies that really informed our knowledge about brain health and dementia risk factors. So the first study that really helped change our thinking was called the FINGER study. And I can't remember what FINGER stands for. Researchers, kind of like our congressmen, like to give acronym names to their research projects to make them memorable. I do know that the FIN stands for Finland, because that's where the study was conducted. But this was the first large randomized controlled trial. And a randomized controlled trial is the gold standard of research. So people are randomly assigned to a treatment group or a control group. And typically, researchers don't know who's in each group, but in this kind of project, the researchers know who's in which group, but the people themselves don't necessarily know. Well, they probably do, given how this plays out. But in the trial group, so the intervention group, people were given a multi-domain intervention. So they were asked to do things to affect their diet, their exercise. They also had cognitive training, and they had vascular risk monitoring, so getting blood pressure and other checks like cholesterol monitoring on a regular basis. Now, the control group just got some general health advice, but they didn't have these structured interventions. And the findings from the study suggested that this kind of multi-domain approach could improve or maintain cognitive function for at-risk elderly people. So at-risk meaning somebody has maybe a first-degree relative who had Alzheimer's disease or who had some other factors that might have raised their risks. So the results of the study showed that in the intervention group, cognitive performance was 25% better than in the control group on average. So that suggested that making changes to diet and exercise, doing things to challenge your brain and keep keep a good just keep checking your heart function to make sure that your heart is functioning as well as it can be beneficial and help reduce your risks of developing dementia. The second study I'll talk about was called the Sprint Mind Study, and again, I cannot remember what that stands for. This was in the U.S., and I'll say the finger study was replicated in many countries around the world. So those results have been replicated many times. For this study, this was explicitly looking at the link between high blood pressure and dementia risk. And they had, again, it was a randomized controlled trial. So people were randomly assigned to the treatment group or the control group. And in the treatment group, people received aggressive treatment for high blood pressure. So aggressive meaning they were attempting to keep blood pressure below 120 over, I think, probably 80. But it was the 120 that's the important number. So if you have high blood pressure and are treated for it, typically your doctor will be happy if you're coming in at somewhere between 120 and 140. They're usually happy with that. Above 140, they tend to get a little concerned again. But they don't typically try to push it all the way down to 120 or below. But the results of this study were so clear that they had to stop it early in order, because it wouldn't have been ethical to continue to deny this aggressive treatment of high blood pressure to the control group. So the results showed a significantly lower number of people in that treatment group were developing mild cognitive impairment, or MCI. So that is sometimes a precursor to Alzheimer's disease or dementia. It's where the changes in your brain are recognizable. So we can, if you did a cognitive test, it would show that there were some issues, but they weren't interfering with your daily life. As I said, the study was cut short, and the findings from this are still percolating through our healthcare system. But eventually, I would hope that most primary care doctors would know about this relationship and will start to treat their patients with high blood pressure a bit more aggressively to keep that blood pressure as low as possible, or at least around below 120. The next study I'll talk about is the U.S. Pointer study. Now, this only finished last year, so it hasn't reported out yet, but it's sort of similar to the finger study. So it's a 2-year trial examining 2 different lifestyle interventions in older adults who are, again, at increased risk for cognitive decline. The interventions vary in intensity and format, but both were getting some kind of intervention. For the control group, they had a self-guided intervention that included education and support. So they had group meetings a couple of times a year for general knowledge and information about a healthy lifestyle. And they also received some guideline-based health coaching. So they were given an annual physical and blood test, but beyond that, they weren't really asked to do very much. On the other hand, the treatment group had a very structured lifestyle intervention. They were asked to do exercise, mostly aerobic, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a minute, 4 times a week at a local gym. They were put on the MIND diet. I'm going to talk about that more as well. They were given some cognitive training on computers, and also they had group meetings to encourage social and intellectual challenges. So that's hitting social engagement and your brain challenging things. And they were also given that guideline-based health coaching, but they had more frequent exams, regular blood tests, and a regular review of their health numbers and goal setting. So the expectation is that the treatment group will show a slower or less cognitive decline than the control group, and I'm anxiously awaiting the results from this because this should give us more support for promoting these kinds of programs and knowledge. So now I'm going to talk about each of those risk factors in a bit more detail. and give you some concrete suggestions of things that you can do that can potentially help reduce your risks of developing dementia. I'm going to start with cardiovascular factors because like that Sprint Mind study, the evidence here is very clear. Things that help your heart, help your brain. So if you have one takeaway from today's presentation, I hope it will be what's good for your heart is good for your brain. That's a good rule of thumb. So in general, improving your cardiovascular function can help reduce the risk of dementia, particularly vascular dementia, which makes sense. So vascular dementia is caused by little mini strokes or sometimes larger strokes that affect areas of the brain. They kill the neurons in the region of those little mini strokes. And as that damage continues, your cognitive function declines. So by supporting your heart health through things like keeping control of high blood pressure, keeping a lid on high cholesterol, and treating both of those, addressing diabetes, although the relationship with dementia is a little bit more unclear with diabetes. Stopping smoking has obvious benefits for your heart, and by reducing the impact on your vascular system more generally, those negative impacts on your vascular system, it should help reduce your risk of developing dementia as well. And then midlife obesity was another of those risk factors in that table at the beginning. So again, carrying excess weight puts strain on your heart, increases the risk of heart attack and stroke. And if you address that, lose weight, and that should help reduce your risks of not only cardiovascular issues, but also brain issues later down the road. The Mind diet. I don't know if anybody here has heard of the Mind diet yet, but it's starting to become a bit more, there's more awareness of this than there was even a year ago. I give this presentation pretty regularly. When I first started giving it, almost nobody had heard of the Mind diet, but now typically about half the folks that I'm speaking to have heard of it. So the Mind diet is a combination of two other diets that are more well-known, the Mediterranean diet and also the DASH diet. So the DASH diet has been around for at least a decade or so, maybe longer. It stands for the Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. So it's a diet that's explicitly designed to help improve your blood pressure. So lower your high blood pressure or risks of high blood pressure. So if you go back to that Sprint study I mentioned before, that showed such a strong link between high blood pressure and cognitive decline, it would make sense that this would be a good diet to try to help reduce your risk of developing dementia as well. So it's a heart-healthy diet. So again, that link between healthy heart and healthy brain. There are currently no set guidelines on how to follow this diet. Instead, it has general recommendations. So when I first started giving this talk, there was really very little information about the Mind diet beyond these basic guidelines. But more recently, if you do a search on Amazon, you'll find some recipe books and things that are relatively new around the Mind diet. And there's lots more information about it. So if you're looking for a weekly meal plan that meets the Mind diet, then you can find that now. But basically, it says eat more of 10 foods, green leafy vegetables, all other vegetables, berries, nuts, olive oil, whole grains, fish, beans, poultry, wine. Wine is always gets a little bit of interest. It doesn't mean if you don't drink now that you should start drinking and that's going to help your brain health. It really means you want to keep, you don't want to drink lots of alcohol, maybe restrict it to wine. And I often get asked about should we be drinking red wine or white wine? I think the jury is still out on that question, although there are clearly some substances that are in red wine that are thought to be brain protective, but it's unclear whether it's actually better than white wine. But really just keep your consumption down to 1 glass a day, and really avoid binge drinking. That's something that we know is pretty damaging. And then you want to eat less of 5 foods. So these are all the fun things, the things we love: butter and margarine, cheese, red meat, fried food, pastries, and sweets. So avoiding those good things. It doesn't mean cut them out entirely. We're human. That's pretty hard to do. We succumb to temptation. But if you can limit your intake of those kinds of foods, that has potentially good impacts on your dementia risks. We're not quite sure why these help your brain, but apart from the heart-brain link, which is pretty clear, but it may also reduce oxidative stress in the brain and inflammation. And as the video said, inflammation is implicated in dementia. It's unclear exactly what that link might be, but and I'm going to talk about stress a bit more in a second. So I'll talk more about why that inflammation might be bad for your brain. Exercise. So the evidence here is also very strong. So of all of the different lifestyle interventions that have been studied, regular exercise seems to be one of the best things that you can do to reduce your dementia risk. So one piece of evidence was a meta-analysis. So a meta-analysis is when researchers take several different studies and examine them all together. They look at the outcomes of those different studies and pool them all together, so they're similar enough that they're comparable, but it gives them a much larger sample size. And what that means is that it gives them a larger effect size, so it's easier to see what the impact of these interventions is. So one meta-analysis showed that regular exercise in middle age could reduce your risks of developing dementia by a massive 30%. So that's huge. Again, this will vary by individual, but it does suggest that this has a big impact on your brain health. Most studies have looked at aerobic exercise, and here what I typically hear is that the federal guidelines of 150 minutes a week is a pretty good guideline. So roughly 20 minutes a day, 20 to 30 minutes a day of moderate exercise. So you want to do something that's going to raise your heart rate, but not, you don't want to overstress it, but you do want to raise your heart rate enough that it's actually having to do some work. Some studies also suggest that there's a benefit from strength training or resistance training, and also from balance or flexibility training. I would suspect that like many things, doing a bit of everything is going to be the best. So I wouldn't just do aerobic exercise to the exclusion of these other types. I would try and do a little bit of everything. So some aerobics, a bit of strength training, and the balance and flexibility training is really important, not only because it helps your core strength and things like that, but it also helps prevent falls. And falls are, when I get to the brain injury, are the #1 cause of brain injury in older adults. So anything that can help reduce your risks of falls is going to be beneficial for your brain in a tangential way. What kind of exercise should I do? What's going to be the best thing for my brain? That's the question I often get. And the answer is whatever you enjoy. So if you don't like walking or running, then don't say I'm gonna start running because that's going to benefit my brain, because you just won't do it. So choose something that you enjoy doing, that you'll stick to. So, for example, I can't bear swimming laps. I think it's really dull. I know many people really enjoy it, but if my doctor said, George, you need to get out there and do some swimming, that's going to be the best thing for your brain. Well, actually, it won't be, because I won't do it. So, on the other hand, I do like to walk. So, and walking is very good. So, if you're walking, you want to speed up your pace a little bit from time to time, so that you're making your heart work a little bit as you're going. But as always, you want to talk to your doctor before you start. If you haven't been exercising in a while, you want to definitely talk to your healthcare professional before you start an exercise regime. And some things we do just by not even thinking about them, like gardening or walking. But other things you need to kind of actively opt into, like doing a yoga class or swimming or water aerobics, or something like Tai Chi for your balance and flexibility. Sleep. So if you remember everything on that table that I showed you early on, you'll know that sleep was not one of those risk factors that was mentioned. And there are a couple of reasons for this, but the main reason is that sleep is very hard to study. So if anybody has ever participated in a sleep study, you'll know it's very unnatural. So typically you're either in a lab or sometimes you're at home, but either way, you're going to be all wired up, and it's not going to be very natural at all. So we can't really study ordinary people's ordinary sleep. It's just not possible, at least with the technology we have now. So the relationship between sleep and dementia is a little unclear as a result of that lack of being able to study it. So, but there have been sleep studies that have shed a little light on that link. One study showed that people sleeping 6 hours or less had a greater risk of developing dementia, 30% more likely to be diagnosed with dementia than those sleeping 7 hours or more. So again, that's a huge risk, or a huge difference between those two groups. But it wasn't a definitive study, but it would suggest that sleeping more, or at least more than 7 hours, is going to be better than sleeping less than 6. Some people ask whether whether naps count. So if I sleep 5 or 6 hours at night, but then I have a nap for an hour or half an hour during the day, does that help? I am not absolutely sure about that, and I don't think we really know. But I think the suggestion would be that getting a full night's sleep is going to be better than a partial night's sleep plus naps. But the naps, if you can only have a partial night's sleep, then the naps are good. They can help the brain do its thing that it normally does while you're sleeping. So if you know anything about sleep, you'll know that our brain is very active while we're sleeping, which seems counterintuitive. But what's happening? So as we sleep, we go through several stages of sleep. There's four stages typically. Several of those are deep sleep or slow wave sleep, where your neurons are all firing in synchronously. So there are these waves of electrical activity going through your brain during deep wave sleep. And then as your sleep becomes shallower, we go into REM sleep, or rapid eye movement sleep. So that's if you open somebody's eyelid when they're in that stage, their eyes are going to be moving back and forth very quickly. And that's typically when we're dreaming. And we believe that this stage of sleep is associated with learning and memory. So it's when our memories are being consolidated from the day before or a few days before. And if you think about it, very often your dreams, if you remember your dreams, they might have a person or some sort of action or situation that's very similar to something you encountered the day before or recently. And that we think is helping you lay down that memory. So also, if you think about not getting enough sleep before something important, like staying up all night before an exam when we were a little younger, you'll probably remember that you didn't do all that well on that exam. In fact, if you had gone and got a good night's sleep, you might have remembered more of what you'd been studying the day before than if you pull that all-nighter and go in without having slept very well. So quality sleep does seem to play an important role in our learning and memory, and in general, our overall health and mood. Stress reduction. So this is another one of those risk factors that's not in that first table. And the reason is the same as for sleep. It's very hard to study stress in living humans. And why might that be? Well, if you think about it, to study stress, you have to put somebody in a stressful situation, and that's not very ethical. So in the old days, before we had very clear laws around human subjects research, scientists were able to do studies that put people in very stressful situations. And I'll talk of just one famous study. It was called the Milgram study. It was at Yale, it was conducted shortly after World War II finished. And the goal was to find out or to shed some light into why the German soldiers did the despicable things they did on orders. And so they had people come into a lab where there was a man in a white coat and a desk, and on the desk was a sort of a radio, a speaker, and a dial. And they were told that on the other side of the wall there was another person who they had to ask questions to, and every time the person got the question wrong, they had to press a button on that dashboard that would shock the person. So, and each time the person got a question wrong, they'd have to raise the intensity of that shock. And so they didn't know, but the person behind the wall was actually part of the experiment. And the interesting finding was that people would continue to turn that dial up, even when the person behind the wall, who wasn't actually being shocked, was screaming in pain and eventually stopped making any noise at all. So those people were in highly, highly stressful situations, but that kind of experiment is simply not allowed any longer. So as a result, stress is quite difficult to research. You can't do a randomized controlled trial around stress. And individuals also vary widely in their stress levels and their responses to environmental stressors. So we think that elevated levels of cortisol, which is the hormone that's released when we're in a stressful situation, that it promotes inflammation not only in your tissues but also in your brain, and that chronic elevated cortisol is also linked with memory problems more generally. So we think that, back to the video, we think that chronic inflammation is another factor in developing dementia or Alzheimer's disease. And there's a pretty clear link between post-traumatic stress disorder, which is being more and more studied thanks to the wars in the Middle East and the impact on our service members. That's shown that those folks with PTSD have an increased risk of dementia. So things that you can do to help reduce your stress, avoid stress more generally, I guess, is one thing, but you can also do some active things like meditation or mindfulness. And meditation, folks, when you hear the word meditation, you think sitting cross-legged and trying to clear your brain of any thoughts. And yes, that you can do that, but you can also do some mindfulness exercises. And there's lots of things you can find on the internet around mindfulness. Very simple things like just pausing for a minute or two in your day and counting your breaths as you try to focus your attention on something that like a spot on the wall, and just count your breath slowly in and out for a couple of minutes. And has demonstrated benefits for reducing stress. And there are more things that you can do as well, but that's just a simple way to help reduce your stress. Social engagement. So this is another, so this was on the table. There is some pretty clear evidence that social engagement helps reduce your risk of developing dementia. So some studies suggested that larger social networks can help prevent cognitive decline. Now, that doesn't mean having 500 friends on Facebook. It means having some meaningful relationships with many different people. So we, as humans, we think that one reason we have such big brains is that we had to navigate very complex social relationships. And so our brain is really hardwired to deal with other people and relate to other people. And we spend a lot of time thinking about others' reactions to us and our reactions to other people. So, and the more different types of people that you're exposed to and engage with, the more your brain is being challenged as a result. So this is seems like a fairly obvious way to help benefit your brain health. And we've all been through this massive experiment in social engagement or social isolation in the last few years. 2020 was pretty hard on many people, and especially folks living with dementia, but also just people more generally. We felt isolated, and most of us didn't really like that very much. It had potentially quite negative consequences for folks, particularly those living in long-term care facilities who weren't able to see their families. But also, there is some emerging evidence that that social isolation that we went through has raised our risks of developing dementia slightly. There are some other long-term studies that show that social engagement is beneficial, protective for your brain. I'll just mention the difference between loneliness and social isolation, because people tend to confuse the two terms, but social isolation is something that's measurable, it's objective. If you live in a remote, on a farm in a remote area with your nearest neighbor a mile away, you are by definition socially isolated. Doesn't mean you're lonely, however. You may have very good relationships with people. You may, drive a few miles to see your friends. You may have lots of great telephone conversations or Zoom conversations. On the other hand, if you live in the middle of a big town, you're clearly not socially isolated, but you may be lonely. So you can be lonely. That's a subjective feeling that only you know how lonely you are. So we can't measure that objectively. Loneliness may be associated with a higher risk of developing dementia, but not necessarily social isolation. And so what can you do? Get out and do things, I guess, is the key recommendation here. So maybe join a club or do some volunteer work, do things out in the community, get together with your friends and family on a regular basis. But again, find things that are meaningful to you, otherwise you won't do them. So my mother is, she's 91 and she's cognitively healthy. I am constantly amazed by how much she gets out and does in terms of this kind of social engagement. So she's got 3 different book groups, can you imagine? And as she goes to lectures and things all the time. So she's definitely very socially engaged, and hopefully that will continue to be protective for her. Hearing loss. So I promised I'd talk a bit more about this. Hearing loss, back on that table, was the largest single factor. So if we addressed hearing loss in all over the world, everybody experiencing hearing loss had that treated, we could reduce the numbers of people developing dementia by up to 8%. So if you think of that in a worldwide context where there's currently about 50 million people worldwide with dementia, 8% is many millions of people. So it's clearly important. However, the link is a little bit unclear of how hearing loss affects dementia. I think there's probably several different pathways. I'll talk about this Johns Hopkins study in a second, but if you think about it, if you have hearing loss and you're not wearing hearing aids, then you aren't getting much stimulation from the environment. So our brains, again, are wired to process information that we receive through our eyes, through our ears, through our nose, and fingertips, and other sensations in the environment. If you're not getting that hearing, the auditory stimulation, then parts of your brain that are built to process auditory signals are going to start atrophying. And so by addressing that hearing loss, you keep those parts of the brain engaged, and you also are then able to participate in what's going on around you. So I'll go back to my mother again. Unfortunately, she does have some hearing loss, and she is very reluctant to wear her hearing aids, partly because she's also got some vision issues and she can't see very well when she tries to put them in, so it's hard for her to put them in. She swears they don't work very well, but I know that when she's wearing them, she hears much better than she's not, and she's able to participate in what's going on around her much, much better. So she does wear her hearing aids to her book group. She kind of refuses to wear them when she's having dinner with me. I'm not sure what that says, but it does make our conversations a little difficult. So hearing loss can also force your brain to work harder, and that means you have less attention and less cognitive capacity for doing other things. And it may cause the brain to shrink more quickly as those parts of the brain atrophy. Now, the Johns Hopkins study, the ACHIEVE study, which stands for Aging and Cognitive Health Evaluation of Elders, actually spelling out that acronym. It was a study, again, a randomized controlled trial. The results were presented last year and published in the Lancet the same day. And I had hoped that it would show such a strong link between hearing loss and dementia risk that it would prompt Medicare to start covering hearing aids, but it wasn't. Unfortunately, it was a little more nuanced, the results. They had nearly 1,000 participants. 3/4 of the participants were, well, a quarter came from a study that had started 30 years ago, so folks that they have been following for a long time, and 3/4 were new participants, and they were all between the ages of 70 and 84, and they all had untreated hearing loss. In those two groups, the hearing intervention, so they had two groups, the hearing intervention, which gave not only hearing aids, but also audiological counseling and how to best use those hearing aids, and regular checkups to make sure that they were still doing what they were supposed to be doing, versus the control group, which had some education around just general aging health, and 6 monthly visits every 3 years. So the treatment group had a big improvement in their self-perceived, so they thought they were communicating better compared to a worsening for the control group. So those people with hearing aids definitely felt that they were more able to take part in what was going on around them. Looking at all of the participants, the hearing intervention really did not have an effect on their risks of dementia. It did see an improvement in memory, but for those within that treatment group who had a higher risk of developing dementia, so they had maybe a first-degree relative again, or they had a genetic marker that suggested they were at higher risk, they did show they showed a marked improvement and a much less chance of developing dementia than the folks in the control group who had the same risk factors. So the key takeaway from this was that a hearing intervention may reduce cognitive change for the population of older adults who are more at risk for cognitive decline. For the other folks, it may improve your social interactions, but it may not necessarily help your brain. But I suspect that it can't hurt. Just a couple more risk factors. So head trauma. So this is traumatic brain injury or other things that typically occur from car and bike accidents or falls, most likely for older adults. We can prevent many of these accidents, and we should. So things like wearing your seat belts while you're driving, or wearing a helmet while you're bicycling, or other protective equipment for activities. Using a walker if you have some balance issues. Make sure that, it's, don't fall into the stigma of using something, or don't be concerned about that. Make sure that you are able to walk securely. So use that walker, use that cane, whatever's going to help you maintain your balance. Taking a falls prevention class. So these are available in most areas. There are things like A Matter of Balance is an evidence-based program for falls prevention. And also making sure that you have your eyes checked regularly, because if you can't see an obstacle, you're more likely to trip on it. Keeping an eye out for side effects from medications can also help reduce your risk of falls. And then finally, addressing some environmental factors like throw rugs. That's always the first thing I look for when I go into somebody's home. It's a very risky thing to have, even though we love them. And make sure that the lighting is strong enough so that you can see obstacles. I think this is the last one. So brain training. There is no clear evidence that any particular type of brain training can reduce your risks of developing dementia, but there's some evidence that doing quite challenging things can have both short and long-term benefits for the brain. So things that are going to make you work a little harder than you're used to. So if you're playing a game or a puzzle that really doesn't pose much of a challenge, then you're probably not doing something that's going to be helping reduce your risk of developing dementia. But if you do something that really makes you think hard or work hard, so games with strategy like bridge or mahjong or gin and chess are going to be better than games that are just a bit more easy, like Parcheesi or checkers. Maybe challenging yourself with some high-level reading material, learning new words, things like that. Or even doing some formal education. So coming to a talk like this is good. So the recommendation always around learning a new language. I don't know about you, but if anybody here has tried to learn a language since they were in early 20s, it's very difficult. Our brains just don't cope with that very well. But the exercise of that, even if you're not able to speak the language, trying to learn new words and new grammar is challenging your brain, and it's making new connections between your neurons. So that's always good. And I'll just leave you with one of our state-supported resources. So actually, it's called Healthy Brain Virginia. This is an initiative of the Virginia Department of Health with our participation. And this provides more information about 4 pillars of brain health. So exercise, diet, brain challenging, and general health, making sure you're generally healthy. So there's lots of good information on this website. I encourage you to have a look at it. There's also information about sleep and some of the other risk factors that I talked about. So that's all I have for you today. I'll leave you with my details and see if there's any questions.
Thank you so much, George. Does anyone have any questions? If you do, feel free to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask a quick question. We did have a question in the chat. This recording will be available on the Aging Together website. Any questions? I think Jill, I hear you talking, but you're not very loud.
Oh, okay.
There
I'm
you
sorry.
are. Okay.
Better?
Yes, excellent. Thank you.
Just a quick question on the hearing loss. I suffer from tinnitus. Does that fit within that category of hearing loss, or kind of where does that, is there information on sort of how that fits in, or if it does at all?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Jill. So I've had this question before, and so I did some investigation, and there wasn't any clear evidence either way whether tinnitus affected your risks of developing dementia. Um, I understand that it gets in the way of doing things that you might otherwise want to do. So I guess maybe trying to minimize its impact on your social interactions and things as much as possible is probably a good thing. But there's no real evidence about the links between tinnitus and dementia.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks. Anyone else? We still have a few minutes in the hour.
This is Tony.
Hi, Tony.
You know, it just seems like dementia has been studied for so many years, and here we could get a cure for all of these other things so quickly. And dementia is such a long, drawn out. You know, how long has it been studied? 50 years or something, and nobody can actually even get one prescription that helps. It just seems impossible.
Yeah, that's a really interesting comment and very true. I mean, dementia, so I guess Alzheimer's disease was first identified nearly 100 or about 100, over 100 years ago now, I think. And billions of dollars have gone into research on Alzheimer's and dementia treatments in the last couple of decades here in the US. And yet we still don't have any effective treatment or cure for the disease. So what I hear currently, well, a couple of things. One is very relevant to this talk. So the more you can do around these modifiable risk factors to help prevent developing dementia, that's the best way. So prevention right now is really the only cure that we have. And we have seen, as a result of improved health and more people exercising and quitting smoking and eating better, we have seen a decline in the age-adjusted rate of dementia. So, for example, at age 85, it used to be about 1 in 2 people had the symptoms of dementia, and now it's down closer to about 1 in 3. And that change has happened since the 1980s, and that's pretty big. And that is seen all down the age ranges. So as we improve our physical health and take better care of ourselves, our risks of developing dementia have fallen. So that's a good thing. As far as the treatments go, the last couple of years have seen some excitement around new treatments being approved by the FDA. They are still not the answer. They may help slow cognitive decline in folks who are in the early stages of dementia. They don't roll back any changes that have already happened. And we think that the changes are happening for up to 20 years in your brain before symptoms emerge. So ideally, you'd want to start the treatments right when those changes are starting to occur, but we can't see them yet. So there's a lot of research going into biomarkers to try and find a blood test that shows that you have a risk of developing dementia, like elevated levels of beta amyloid or tau. But it seems, and from what I hear from the researchers I talk to, it seems like the most likely thing will be a cocktail of different approaches. So it may be some lifestyle changes, it may be some drugs, but it's not going to be a magic pill that's going to just be a one-shot deal, at least not for many years. So we'll see. But the research is rapidly evolving, and I'm hopeful that we'll see some actual, real beneficial medications in the next 5 years.
We have it's 1 o'clock. Do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
Okay. Kathy, did you have a question?
I did. Is there anyone else?
No, go ahead.
Just George, just curious what other countries might be doing. And do we have information on that where countries have lower rates of dementia than we do here in the US?
Yeah, great question. So I don't know if I keep hearing about the blue zones, and that usually comes up when I give this talk. So I don't think there are a few countries that do have lower risks of dementia. I think Japan is one, Singapore, places that are typically have a diet rich in fish and poultry and eat much less red meat. Cities tend to have slightly lower rates of dementia because people walk more. So but for countries as a whole, there's not a huge amount of difference that I'm aware of. I know that many countries are aging rapidly that don't have much support and experience with large numbers of older people. And their rates of dementia are going up pretty sharply. So, yeah, it's an interesting one, but it seems like the blue zones are very contained, small areas like the island of Okinawa in Japan, or Loma Linda in California, or I think Sardinia in Italy. So they tend to be small, often islands. People have that kind of Mediterranean lifestyle approach to diet, and they exercise more. They have very strong social connections. So the factors that help reduce their rates of dementia are the ones that we're talking about today. So I think if everybody was able to do all of those things, we'd certainly see a lot less dementia.
Great. Thank you so much, George. We really appreciate you being here. Dementia risk, education, brain health is such an important topic. And thank you all for joining the Tuesday Noontime series. And thanks to our sponsor, Oakview National Bank, for sponsoring and making this possible. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Anna.
Thanks so much, George. Bye-bye.
See you later.